Lymphomas are a cancer from a cell we call lymphocytes, a blood-derived cell. And lymphocytes normally are responsible for the immune system. So it's a cancer of the immune system. We recognize two major categories, so-called Hodgkin's disease and non-Hodgkin's lymphomas. Non-Hodgkin's lymphomas are certainly the more common variety and collectively represent about 24 or more different entities that have different presentations, natural histories, treatments, and outcomes. We treat the lymphomas differently based on the type of lymphoma. Very generally speaking, aggressive lymphomas are the lymphomas that can progress very rapidly and kill a patient in a matter of months. But by virtue of the fact that the cells are dividing rapidly, it makes them more sensitive to chemotherapy and therefore possible to eradicate and cure with aggressive chemotherapy. In the indolent lymphomas, on the other hand, the strategy is more to treat only if patients develop symptoms or threaten to develop symptoms or complications from the lymphoma. The reason is that a certain number of patients, even over decades, sometimes never need treatment in their lifetime. The second reason is that even if a patient needs treatment, he or she may not require treatments for years before symptoms arise and it becomes necessary to treat. And lastly is the idea that if you treat lymphomas, especially one that's incurable, one may have to go through several treatments over one's lifetime. And whenever you treat a lymphoma, whatever survives and comes back later has a potential of being more resistant to the same treatment or even other treatments. So the idea is not to waste unnecessarily therapies for purely cosmetic reasons and then later regret that we don't have that agent or chemotherapy available when we really need it. Bendamustine is a very old drug that really was developed in the Second World War in East Germany and was quickly recognized to have potential for treatment of cancers, in particular lymphoma, in that country. And they had decades of experience with that drug as a standard of care for lymphomas before the reunification of Germany. Following the reunification in Germany, West Germany had access to the drug and really were leaders in further developing the drugs in clinical trial and appreciating its spectrum of activity and developing indications for the drug. From West Germany, then the experience spread throughout Europe, and later, once certain commercial agreements were put in place to North America, in particular the United States, and in fact, both Europe and the United States had had much more experience in advance of us here in Canada. Health Canada in August approved two major indications for the use of bendamustine, which has been commercialized under the trade name of Troyanda. The first one is the treatment in first line of symptomatic chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which is the commonest leukemia in the Western world. And the second major indication is the second-line therapy of indolent non-Hodgkin's lymphomas that have either progressed or failed standard treatments that included an agent we call Rituxan. It's possible to combine bendamustine and other agents. Perhaps the most important combination is with an antibody, a type of protein, which is not a chemotherapy as such, but a type of protein which has been developed to target specifically B cells in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's also a number of ongoing trials looking at bendamustine combination with other agents, and depending on the results of these trials, it is highly likely that bendamustine will be used in combination with some of these other agents in the not too distant future. If we first look at chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, there's been a number of trials, but perhaps the one that is most often cited is the randomized trial comparing bendamustine with chlorambucil the latter being probably the drug that's most commonly prescribed in older patients. All this to say is that response rates and a particular time to progression superior by a factor of 2 to 3 in favor of bendamustine relative to chlorambucil. If we look at the results and the efficacy of bendamustine in indolent lymphomas, again, a number of trials have been performed, but perhaps the one that has had the greatest impact is that by Rummel and colleagues in Germany, who gave an update of the results of both the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the European Society of Hematology meetings held just this past June. In that study, patients with indolent lymphoma, including mantle cell lymphoma, were randomized to receive either bendamustine plus Rituxan versus the standard care in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, generally a combination we call R-CHOP. What was really quite striking is that bendamustine Rituxan, despite demonstrating superior efficacy to R-CHOP, with essentially a doubling of what we call the progression-free survival, did so with reduced toxicity. This reduced toxicity included less hematological toxicity and the infections that may result from hematological toxicity, as well as other things that patients appreciate quite well, such as essentially the absence of hair loss, which is really quite common in the standard care with R-CHOP. The approval of bendamustine by Health Canada in August is very likely to change the standard care in Canada for patients who have CLL or indolent lymphomas. The demonstration of lower toxicities and oftentimes superior efficacy for bendamustine, I think will lead to many physicians who specialize in the treatment of this disease to incorporate bendamustine in their treatment algorithms or for different types of patients. Bendamustine has potential to be used in the future in pathologies other than chronic lymphocytic leukemia or indolent non-Hodgkin's lymphomas. For example, recent trials have demonstrated its efficacy in multiple myeloma. There's been interest in using high-dose bendamustine for conditioning in the stem cell transplant setting, and there's also been exploration of bendamustine in non-hematological solid tumors. It's interesting to note that bendamustine increasingly is part of the backbone to be used in combination with different drugs and different pathologies in existing and new trials in cancer in general. So I think the prospect for us to see bendamustine in a broader spectrum of pathologies is likely in the future. If we look in the chemotherapy front, things have been relatively static for the treatment of lymphomas for really a couple of decades now. And I would say that the arrival of bendamustine is really a major change and really offers a prospect of less toxic and more potent combinations in the future. The experience with bendamustine by clinicians in Canada have been relatively limited. Fortunately for me, I had the opportunity to work with bendamustine either on patients that were in clinical trial before it was approved by Health Canada, or in individual cases where we were able to obtain permission to use bendamustine on compassionate grounds from Health Canada and a manufacturer, Lundbeck. And I can say that in most cases, I was extremely pleased as a clinician with the result. And if I can cite one patient who had mantle cell lymphoma that was referred to me and had been referred after he had proven refractory to 2 lines of therapy, and in fact was at a stage where he was being offered palliative radiotherapy and probably had a life expectancy that was less than 1 year. And it was actually very gratifying to see that after 2 cycles of bendamustine. He was already in complete remission with virtually no significant toxicity. And now, in fact, his outlook is completely different. He's now a candidate for a potentially curative stem cell transplant. And so it's really quite gratifying to see a patient who faced almost certain death and really no viable prospects to also now have a chance at getting his life back. And I have other patients who had similarly dramatic benefits from the arrival of new drugs. And so, yeah, as a clinician, it's always great to have access to new drugs that enable us to offer better treatments to our patients.